Nú komið aðal fyrirlesara dagsins, Dr. Tom Fleming, frá Tom Fleming Creative Consultancy. Hann einn helsti sérfræðingur í málefnum tengdu skapandi greinum og hefur unnið sem ráðgjafi fyrir fjölmörg lönd auk Evrópusambandsins. Hann mun kynna stöðu tölfræði menningar og skapandi greina í löndunum í kringum okkur og fara yfir helstu álitaefni og áskoranir í tölfræði menningar og skapandi greina. Tom, you're here. The floor is yours. We're all waiting.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure, real honor to be here as well in this lovely building. I think it's 7 years since I was in Iceland, which is slightly humbling. And it is an absolute coincidence. It was just before the crisis that I was here last, and I guess hopefully we're just out of the crisis that I return. I feel I've returned a week too late because it would have been brilliant to be in town last week with the Airwaves Festival on, and it's incredible the profile that it got back in the UK, and maybe that's just the media that I plug into, but I think it demonstrates that the disproportionate cultural influence that you have coming from Iceland, and this is not a fluke. This is something that's been going for over a generation now. That's something that's, in a sense, unquantified, but it's so quantifiable in terms of your sense of culture, your sense of identity, and the brand, the profile of Iceland internationally. And I suppose wrapped up in that is this challenge that policymakers certainly face, but I think also as a sector you face, in that people recognize, understand, appreciate the value of culture, of cultural practice, of the creative industries, of the creative economy, depending on what you want to call it. They know that it's important, but sometimes when it comes to the crunch, there still seems to be this disconnect in terms of acting on that significance, in terms of dedicated investment and support, in terms of enshrining the importance of the sector as something that can help to develop not just a strong economy, but also a society that puts and values culture as a key ingredient in terms of the way of life, in terms of identity, in terms of notions of sustainability or sustainable prosperity and things like that. So there's a sense, I feel from a distance, that Iceland has and understands the importance of culture and the creative industries as part of its kind of DNA. But on another level, it has difficulty talking about that and actually articulating and quantifying and being able to respond effectively to that value. I'm going to speak today broadly in two halves. The first half of what I want to talk about is just to kind of critically reflect on some of the challenges that we face and that policymakers face, but also researchers, statisticians, and the cultural and creative industry sector itself, in terms of being able to define what it is, in terms of being able to articulate and measure that value, to be able to demonstrate value, and to be able to effectively use that as a way of shaping effective policy and investment. And then the second half is just to respond to some practical, almost exam questions that I was set by the organizers here, which is a way of framing the discussions that you have after lunch in the workshop settings. And I suppose all of this, my thinking here is couched from a professional background, which is broadly about telling the story of the role of culture and the creative industries in development. That's in economic development, but it's also in terms of the kind of places, societies that we hope that we all want to live in and thrive in. It's broadly from a cultural and creative industries policy and strategy background, but also from a kind of commentary and critical analysis perspective. And we also do a lot of primary research ourselves, so we have to grapple with the baseline data that is provided by the likes of national statistic organizations, by government departments, and often or increasingly something that sits within the private domain, where large companies are developing data which you have to buy to be able to access, to be able to then utilize and surround with perhaps some complementary qualitative research. So this is perhaps from a practitioner perspective as well as from a strategic development perspective. And a fundamental point I want to make at the heart of this is that ultimately, if in Iceland and elsewhere you're going to have smart, effective policy and investment, this absolutely has to be based on evidence and a level of detail and a level of robustness that can translate into effective action. What we have all over Europe and beyond is this kind of strategic impasse where the data isn't good enough, or the data isn't relevant, isn't updated sufficiently often, where there isn't enough comparable data, where there are contestations around definition, and where there are political influences which influence what kind of value that we're looking for. So you get this kind of inertia, ultimately, which means that either you get the wrong policies or you don't get any policy and investment at all. And policymakers broadly are kind of struck in this bind where they're not quite sure, what it is that we should be measuring. What is it that ultimately, I think, what do we value? Why it is that we should be measuring these things. So what's the terms of engagement here? How the hell do we even measure them? Individually, but also collectively, internationally. And by the time you get to somehow answering that question, you forget why it is that you're doing it in the first place. So there's this kind of contortion act going on all the time in policy making, where we're losing sight of what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, and how the hell we get there to deliver something that's effective. We also get, particularly where there's a lot of political kind of turmoil, a lot of people changing seats, changing posts, changing governments, you get a lot of quick fixes. You get a lot of what we call policy-based evidence making, where there's a manifesto pledge about the importance of culture to society, or about the importance of the creative industries and generating all these jobs, and it's the fastest growing sector, and it must be because there's data from the UK that tells us this, or wherever else. But actually, there is a real, inherent in that, there are all sorts of contradictions in terms of definitions, in terms of the overarching strategic rationale for supporting, investing in this sector. And as my colleague Justin O'Connor says, that statistics ultimately are political tools. They're not just neutral acts, because ultimately there are some value judgments being made in terms of what kind of sectors we're looking to support, why we're looking to even begin to legitimize investing in measuring them. And so by the time you get to a strategy, if you get to a strategy, this is something that is already loaded, is already partial, it already has value judgments placed across it. And often these value judgments are inconsistent and lack coherence. And they're always partial. So what is it in Iceland you are talking about when you talk about culture, creative industries, creative economy, the arts? I'm getting mixed messages, and I get mixed messages wherever I go. Culture. Are we talking about culture in a kind of Raymond Williams-esque way? Culture as a way of life. Culture as a holistic thing that distinguishes us in this society from other societies. And what are the contributory elements to that culture, that way of life? What is the role of the arts in that definition of culture? So if culture is everything, is the arts something specific within culture? Is it, as this quote suggests, primarily about producing work for their beauty and emotional power? Or are artists also political? Are artists also economic agents? Are artists also trying to deliver social value, educational value? Are they trying to attract tourism? Are they trying to have effects on regeneration, on health and well-being? So where does the arts fit within the definition of culture? Creativity, another word that gets used all of the time in this context. Is it creativity as a way of seeing, a way of doing? Is it creativity as a process? Is it creativity as an outcome? Is it creativity, are we all creative, or only some of us creative? Are some of us more so creative than others? Are some sectors more creative than other sectors? Does the creative industries have all of the creativity, or are there creative jobs in other sectors? The cultural industries. Cultural industries is perhaps the oldest term which has tried to simultaneously speak up the economic outcomes, the economic value of culture, the arts, as well as talking about its intrinsic value, the creative, cultural elements that drive practice and production and consumption. So way back in the UK in the 80s, the cultural industries movement was starting to really flourish. And this was around recognizing that there's always an economy to culture. Whether this is an economy that is intentionalized, that is at the forefront of thinking for artists, for cultural practitioners, but there's always a value chain relationship. It always generates value. It often generates value that is monetized, whether that be through tickets, through content that's sold, that's distributed and sold. The cultural industries still has a lot of currency at a political level and a strategic level internationally. UNESCO, for example, which I've already heard mentioned this morning, still talks about the cultural industries rather than the creative industries. Partly, that's a kind of Francophile perspective where the French, and France being where UNESCO is based, the French cultural influence suggests that talking about the creative industries and emphasizing the word industries is a notional kind of Anglo-Saxon, or it's not. You take away the aesthetics and the intrinsic value by talking about the creative industries. But I think it's also just the way the language has evolved, and there was a moment in the 80s and early 90s where the cultural industries had the greatest strategic currency. And then we had the growth of the creative industries. So way back, 1998 or so, the UK government, the new UK government, under Blair, remember him, had a Minister of Culture called Chris Smith. And he has subsequently said that he was basically being strategically pragmatic. He was a lover of the arts. He was absolutely passionate about the value of culture in society. He was aware of a disconnect in terms of the social, cultural, and economic value of the sector, the wider sector, the creative arts, and the way that they were being supported or understood at government level. This is after a generation of cutting cultural organizations, a generation of understanding growth and competitiveness as the preserve of certain sectors over and above other sectors. And also from a position of recognizing that there was a lack of diversity in the economy, and that if you're going to develop and to grow a sustainable and competitive economy long term, you need to have a mix. And you need to have people providing different kinds of value within that mix. So Chris Smith, the Minister of Culture, back in 1998, commissioned a mapping document and subsequently commissioned a better mapping document 3 years later. At the same time, this was developed as part of a whole policy broadside to develop a clearer position for culture and the creative industries within the overarching strategic narrative of the country. He set up a creative industries task force, set up all sorts of dedicated research exercises to try to understand better the role of culture, creative industries in society. This in turn influenced regional and local government and investment. And in turn, as we've seen internationally, has actually surprised, as a surprise to him and surprise to colleagues at that time, has almost generated its own industry, a policy industry related to the creative industries internationally. The creative industries was defined very broadly as those industries which have their skill and origin in individual creativity, blah, blah, blah. You've probably seen that quote lots of times over the years. It was defined, though, specifically in terms of a set of sectors. And this is where the battle starts to begin, and the battle lines are drawn. What's in, what's out? Why are they in? Why is something in? Why is something not in there? And critically, although this wasn't talked about enough at the time, what are the interrelationships between these sectors? What do they have in common? What do they share? How do they connect with each other? How do they trade? What does that mean in terms of their consistency or coherence as a notional sector, when ultimately, let's face it, you're dealing with lots of sectors here, and what's their role within a wider economic system? And also, what's their role in relation to the arts, the cultural sector, the social sector, the education sector, and what's their role in place, in context, in a specific city, town, region, and ultimately at a national level? A couple of years ago, there was a review of these subsectors or sectors, and we're now down to 11 in the UK. But there was a real movement from the government then to take crafts out. So the Crafts Council of England absolutely went ballistic, went crazy. How can you take crafts out? Crafts is a central creative industry. The reason they wanted to take it out, because it was somehow seen as being blurred between the subsidy-dependent and the commercial. It was seen as something that was about cultural practice rather than commercial and economic development. And it was seen as also a micro-business sector that wasn't delivering the kind of scalable business trajectories which are particularly fashionable in certain ministries, particularly ministries relating to trade and growth. So they're looking for the quick wins often, the big scalable creative businesses rather than the wider creative sector. This is another way of articulating this creative industries definition. This is by the Work Foundation in about 2007 or so. God, that looks horrible up there. Suffice to say that in the middle, this is a very clumsy way of them trying to discuss the different kinds of creative acts and how they sit within an overarching creative system, as they called it. So in the middle, there you've got your poet, perched on in a tree house, sitting there, thinking about the beauty of life and occasionally writing something down. That may or may not have an economic value. It may or may not have a transaction that in turn influences something else and then something else and something else. You may ultimately end up with a multi-million grossing film out of that creative act sitting up in the treetop. But that's ultimately probably wasn't the point. But they tried to very crudely articulate a set of steps from the creative moment through to the production, the distribution, the sale, and influencing ripple effects, spillover effects into the rest of the economy. And of course, it's overly simplistic and doesn't really help anybody in terms of developing a smart policy in relation to that sector. But it's a part of the policy debate. And critical thing is, I think, it's a critical point to make here is that it's important to have that policy debate. Because when you come down to it, when you come down to developing your baseline, your sector statistics, you ultimately have to draw the line somewhere and say what's in or what's out. So this graph shows different ways of articulating the value of the creative industries in Sweden, depending on which statistics you use, and which definitions you use, and which international definitions you draw upon, whether it be WIPO's definition, whether you're using UNESCO's definitions, or you're using European Union's definitions. It gives you quite different pictures in terms of the size of the sector, if you're looking for pure economics. The Japanese have decided in their infinite wisdom, and probably based on a lot more research than a lot of European policies, what they think is important. And they've tried to make links between things where there's a historic cultural strength and something that has provenance and authenticity and is seen as somehow intrinsically Japanese, and stuff that is more generic, often in the creative services sector that works in the mainstream of their creative industries, of their creative economy. So they have a different definition. And this is being used to inform their Cool Japan program, which is an extremely expensive, export-driven funding program for creative industries businesses in Japan, being delivered for two reasons. One is to increase trade for the country through the creative industries, and the other is to generate this wider soft power outcome, this cultural identity stuff, which I talked about with Iceland earlier on, which they feel they've kind of slipped down the kind of global charts when it comes to the extent to which they're seen, heard, understood, recognized for their cultural strengths, and recognized for their creativity. So they're looking for kind of feedback loops here that in turn influence inward investment, tourism, that in turn help attract or retain talent, those kinds of outcomes as well. And then we get to the creative economy. So cynically, you could say this is the ultimate catch-all. We've had enough of trying to define the creative industries, what's in, what's out. We've got so far with that. It's given us a sense that there is something in it, and there are lots and lots of jobs, and if you cut it this way, it is a really high growth sector, and it's continued to grow, and it's been resilient through the crisis and those kinds of things. But what about all the other creative jobs in other sectors? And what about the non-creative jobs in the creative industries sector, those accountants, those lawyers, all of those people that ultimately distort the figures? If we're just talking about creative processes, creative activities, you look at your average, it's interesting seeing the London stats, your average major agglomerator international media company based in London, how many jobs in that business are actually in the act of creative production? How many of those jobs are outsourced in the creative production? Or how many creative production jobs are there in other sectors, in the health sector, in the education sector, in pharmaceuticals, which are about creative practice, which aren't counted in the creative industries? So the notion of the creative jobs is that it's an economic systems, as we kind of go post-industrial, as we go into this overarching, knowledge-intensive industries, creativity is the kind of oil and the glue. Creativity is the thing that differentiates. Creativity is the thing that powers innovation, that enables you to develop those value-adding goods, services, products, and ultimately enables you to deliver a kind of prosperity which is out of reach for societies that aren't able to embed creative practice across their economy. That's the kind of proposition posited by the creative economy theory. And it's also, I guess, and correctly, it's predicated on an understanding that economies are increasingly fluid and that practice is increasingly interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral, interdepartmental, boundary crossing, and that ideas are generated through collaboration, through a new set of often shifting interdependencies, and they're not set within hermetically sealed sector definitions. And that even within the creative industries definition that I showed you earlier on, even within that sector, there are all sorts of interdependencies and interrelationships that flow into new business models, new ways of working, new ways of practicing, and therefore generate different kinds of economic outcomes. So another way of looking at it is that if you put a load of graphic designers in a room together, they don't want to talk to each other. They want to talk to the people that they'll get the business off or the people they'll share ideas with. And so the convergence of cross-sector working is increasingly the norm and will become more so, and therefore the creative economy perhaps is a neater way for some of understanding the role of creativity in our overall economy and how to strategize and plan and invest around that. I could go on. Experience economy, knowledge economy, smart economy, sharing economy. Where does this end? Where does the creative industry sit within this? What kind of strategic narrative games are at play here? And this is where governments, working in consultation with their sector or their sectors, need to work pretty firmly to develop shared terms of reference that works in a specific context. And don't get carried away with this flighty, kind of almost boundaryless approach towards understanding the economy. And it becomes a kind of almost a privileged exercise in positioning competitiveness or cultural creative superiority. In London, I almost spat my cappuccino out when I was reading the Evening Standard talking about a flat white economy a couple of years ago. So what the hell does that mean? It's this assumption that there's these kind of relatively high-paid, culturally literate, socially mobile, globally connected knowledge workers who used to be called creative workers, and now they're working in the flat white economy, as if the people working in research and development and innovation and in Korea and China don't also drink nice coffee on occasion. So there's a development conceit sometimes that we've got to be careful with here. There's a superiority addiction wrapped up sometimes in the policy debate about the significance of the creative industries, the cultural industries, the role of these sectors in our society. There's an assumption which often isn't underpinned by evidence and data, and certainly isn't always owned by the sector it's seeking to serve, which suggests that this is important because we're better at it than other countries. We've developed this far. We're in this position now where we have this disposable income, this leisure time, we have the freedom of choice, we have the freedom of expression, all those kinds of things that enable us to grow this sector in ways that other countries can't. And this becomes a little bit addictive for policymakers, certainly at a regional level, more so than at a national level. Because ultimately, national governments often have the resources to invest more effectively in having strong evidence-based policy rather than policy-based evidence-making. Cities and regions don't often have that. So you get them grasping at straws, often post-industrial, divided, poor, fallen off the kind of global map when it comes to relevance. So they kind of preface their economic strategy with the word creative. Or they will talk about their knowledge economy as if this has come from nowhere and now is the future. It's kind of lazy, but also understandable, and rarely is it sufficiently evidence-based. And certainly, in most cases, it's not evidence-based in a way that would survive any kind of critical probing. And certainly, it's very difficult to get comparative data from cities and regions internationally. Now, having said all of that, there's of course something in it. And that where there have been long-term strategic approaches towards developing consistent data and comparable data, however the sector is defined, at least it tells us things that we wouldn't otherwise know. And at least it gives us some clear, at least evidence, if you couldn't call it evidence, you'd call it some clear implications as to what this means for the way our economy is going and the way our society as well is changing. You will note, though, that it's always primarily foregrounded in economic outputs rather than a more holistic set of cultural or social outcomes. And this goes back to my original point around value and culture and the role of culture in society. And what kind of society are we trying to develop? What kind of economy do we want to have? What does growth mean in this context? So I would be interested in a sense for you in Iceland, do these statistics even impress you? For another small country in Scotland, does this kind of stuff, how much does this kind of stuff matter? Or what matters most? Is it the numbers of businesses, the numbers of jobs? Is it the GVA that they generate? Or is it the quality, the value that they generate for well-being, the value that they generate for other sectors, notably things like tourism, the wider innovation, ecology? What matters most to you? And when you get a country like the UK, these figures have enormous traction for often the wrong reasons at government level, because they disguise the complexity that sits beneath them. I think it's important to have them, because otherwise you don't get the creative industries, the cultural sector at large, you don't get around the policy-making table, but they disguise the complexity that generated these kinds of figures in the first place. Because the way that they're currently translated is purely in terms of economic growth, the speed of growth, the scale of growth. The jobs created, the jobs retained, the investment attracted, the investment leveraged. There's a process that has contributed to that, which goes right back to the role of creative education, the role of artists, collaborations in co-working spaces, the scene you have in the bars of your city, the role of cultural institutions and commissioning work, the role of the galleries and museums, the festival sector. There's a whole ecosystem there that's contributed to this, which gets denied when it comes to the policy-making table in terms of what matters most, because they want to just reach out to and connect with those businesses that are more palpably generating the value that is articulated through these figures. So that tends to mean that creative gets conflated with digital. And we're talking about software businesses. We're talking about aggregator businesses in high-yield bits of the value chain and not the rest. That's the political interpretation of the statistics. The reason that that's happening is because there isn't that surrounding policy conversation, and there isn't that sector engagement that goes beyond those relatively high-growth businesses to talk about how they got to grow in the first place and what matters to them when it comes to their skills needs, their investment needs, their recruitment needs. So it's that old adage, it's the economy stupid. But what kind of economy? And on what terms? On whose terms? And how can this be squared with a policy agenda which, at the moment, all over Europe, is celebrating the growth potential of the creative industries on the one hand, and yet, on the other hand, is cutting investment in the arts and cultural sector, and is eroding the importance of creative education in the classroom, and is therefore, in a sense, cutting the roots from the tree. And it's because there's data that gives us the numbers, but there isn't evidence and intelligence that surrounds the numbers that articulates how those numbers were, in a sense, produced, how that value was generated. Now, the European Union, to be fair, is a bit more nuanced often, and there's a kind of social project, obviously, that sits at the heart of it, as well as an economic project. So they will fall victim to these kind of quite crude comparative statistical statements. You know, it's important to be able to say that the creative industries is bigger than the automobile industry. For them, they need to say these things, because otherwise people still won't listen. But it's also important to be able to talk about the value chain relationships and the different kinds of sectors that play an important role within that. This is also, though, just to show that everybody's working from different numbers, because this recent piece of work that was undertaken for the Commission, I can't remember who by, can't remember. Anyway, apparently the visual arts is the biggest sector by turnover in the whole of the European creative industry sector, which struck me as being highly implausible. I'm sure that the visual arts sector would love to be talked of in those terms, but I don't think that's in any way likely. So there's a question at the heart of their methodology and where they get their numbers from and how they process them there anyway. But at least they're talking about the range of outcomes at a European level that are important for the creative industries. But I guess there's a fundamental point always here, is that are we dealing with apples and apples or apples and pears? To what extent can we compare? Can we compare through methodology? Can we compare through the definitions? And can we compare through the way that these things are interpreted? Is there a professional, intellectual and policy-making community at an international level that has a coherent approach to working with the numbers and working with the values that they suggest to be able to develop a shared narrative? I suggest there probably isn't. Which means that although there's something in it, and the cultural sector, the arts, the creative industries, the creative economy is clearly something that, however it's understood, is a major part of the economy here, in Iceland and Europe and elsewhere in the global north, but also the global south. Unless we have a dedicated and much clearer approach to data generation and the intelligence gathering that surrounds that data, and unless it's done in a more collaborative, sector-driven way, but still consistent across different territories, we won't be making the most of that sector. We won't be, in a very crude way, making the most of its growth potential, but also we won't be making the most of the value that it can generate to other parts of our society. Overall, there are some major knowledge gaps in terms of the profile and dynamics of the creative industries sector across Europe, across the world. I've mentioned the definitional issues. There are inconsistencies in what's in, what's out, why one thing's described as in one way and one thing in one country and in another way in another country. There are also issues around size. I think this was mentioned earlier on. The sector is increasingly a micro business, a freelance sector. In some countries, that makes it statistically very challenging. In the UK, if you have a turnover less than £75,000, then you don't need to be VAT registered, which means that's one mechanism for being able to find that business and measure that business is gone. And it seems that there's a collective wisdom now which suggests that the freelance economy, i.e. people who work for themselves, in the UK and other northern European countries is going to be bigger than the public sector within the next 5 years. So there's potentially a huge bit of the creative industries which isn't even being measured. In Iceland, you've probably got a much better chance than anywhere else in measuring that sector, because your sample size in Iceland can effectively be 100% if you resource this appropriately. The speed of change is another thing. The way that sector definitions that worked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, don't work today. And there's always a catch-up process in terms of the standard industrial and occupational classifications you need to be able to measure certain sectors. So the publishing sector today is an utterly different sector to what it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It's been unceremoniously disrupted by digital technology in such a way that it's almost become a sector that is disaggregated beyond definition. So how do we measure that? How do we define that? There are issues around data ownership, government sitting on data, departments sitting on data, private organizations who make their business in selling data, not releasing their data. There are huge issues around GVA. It's one thing to measure GDP, gross domestic product, and the kind of tangible productivity of a sector. It's another thing to measure its GVA. No one really has found a way to do that effectively yet. There's a thing around problem versus question, which is, as I mentioned earlier on, is that there seems to be an inconsistency in terms of why it is we're researching certain things. What is the problem we're trying to solve, or what is the opportunity we're trying to pursue? That's never always clear in a brief. And there are all sorts of asymmetries between those that have the data and those that are seeking to interpret the data. There isn't a coherent research community that's able to develop a shared terms of reference to develop knowledge around the sector. So you have these gaps in knowledge. They're partly attributable to methodological challenges, but there are also methodological challenges because those gaps in knowledge are so hard to bridge. There are methodological challenges in terms of the quality of the data. So to what extent is a baseline? How up to date is it? How inclusive is it? How much are we falling victim in our assumptions because the data is not good enough in the first place? There are issues around the quality of analysis. So it's one thing to run the data, another thing is to surround that data with really in-depth intelligence, research that works to make sense of and to problematize that data. There are issues, as I mentioned, around consistency, around benchmarking. So where are we today in relation to where we were yesterday? Where are we in relation to other sectors? How effectively are other sectors defined, let alone this sector? There are issues around causality, real lack of longitudinal research, and so long versus short term becomes an issue. Critically, there are issues around engagement. So to what extent does the sector or the sectors own these definitions? To what extent do they feel part of a research and intelligence gathering process? How have they been engaged? And a challenge here for a country is the extent to which you personalize that. Because if your sector tells you that actually these are the things that are important, that has implications for comparability with other countries that are undertaking research. So how do you develop a shared ownership of the research narrative? So you have a shared ownership of the outcomes of that research, and you have a shared ownership of the strategic policy interventions that happen as a consequence. How do you do that in a context when people feel often that they're being over-consulted or inappropriately consulted? And then if you're going to embark on a big, large research exercise, how do you manage expectations so that people feel that this is going to do something that ultimately benefits their participation? So as a consequence of those different gaps, we have lots of really bad policy and lots of inappropriate investment. Or worse, we don't have any policy or any investment. So we get lots of generic policy statements. We are the creative nation. The sector is very important to us, all those kinds of things. But there's a real lack of coherence. There's a lack of coherence between the rhetoric and the reality in terms of the policy platforms. There are issues around the gaps between different departments, gaps between different sectors. There's an absence of evaluation and monitoring right across the public sector in terms of the interventions that they make. And there are real questions ultimately around who this is for and who benefits. A slight social point to make here is that the creative industries is a disproportionately middle class, in diverse societies, disproportionately white sector. To what extent does the policy amplify and perpetuate that existing talent base? Or how do you go beyond those that aren't mapped, who aren't working in the sector, who aren't statistically significant yet? But that's your talent base. It's a talent-based sector. So how do you ensure that you develop policy and interventions that reach the unreached in terms of the mapping? So what you need, ultimately, is a value proposition here. To develop collectively as a country a shared value proposition for the role and the value of culture and the creative industries in your country. We've just had something called the Warwick Commission in the UK, which tried to do that. And it tried to make the case, somewhat clumsily, but sometimes there were moments of real clarity, that we need to develop a systematic policy review underpinned by a systematic approach to evidence gathering and collection, which positions the cultural and creative industry sector on an equal footing with other key sectors in society, not just in the economy, in society, so including health, education, and welfare. So a holistic understanding of culture and of cultural value. The European Union, as I mentioned, is starting to do that more, but they're always kind of one step behind the way the sector's going. And they often fall back in the comfort zone of making clear or making pure economic arguments rather than social and cultural arguments. The United Nations, through their creative economy reports, is quite sophisticated here in articulating a wider value proposition. I recommend you look at this document as a kind of reference point, because they talk about local development pathways. They use words like community. I mean, I can't imagine the word community ever being used in government in the UK when they talk about the creative industries. Or if it would be the business community rather than the wider community, the place, the resources, the cultural resources you have in a city in a region. They're also looking for a consistent approach to measurement. This is mostly around trying to influence measurement within a notional developing world context where there's such a gap in terms of the evidence base that's there. But why couldn't we develop the same kinds of tools and indicators in the global north as well as in the global south? And we're moving towards having, I guess, a more nuanced understanding of the different outcomes that the creative and cultural sector plays. So a diverse baseline. There's not one baseline. There are different ways of understanding the overall mix. So Nesta in the UK plays quite an important role there. They will map the clusters. They will look at the creative jobs in non-creative sectors. They will look at the maker spaces and creative hubs across the country. So you're looking at a different understanding of the baseline. The baseline is not just the numbers of jobs, the numbers of businesses. The baseline is what they do, where they work, what their aspirations are, how they connect, how they work with other sectors. So the baseline is your ecosystem and not just your economy. This is a map of tweets generated by creative and knowledge businesses in central East London. So there are different ways of gathering knowledge and mapping and different ways of telling the story. Spillover effects are particularly interesting here. There's a growing movement at a policy level in Europe to look at the spillover effects, the wider value adding role of investment in the cultural and creative industries. Doctor Who, does that travel to Iceland? No? Ah, there you go. The conceit of the... Oh, I don't watch it, but one of the old Doctor Who's, David Tennant, he's probably been on your TVs. Anyway, he before the last election, there was this, there's always this posturing, this clamoring for attention, and the point he makes is the creative industries feed into one another. There are interdependencies. There's an ecosystem and not just an economy here. And that if you cut one bit off, everybody else suffers. And this is related broadly to a kind of spillover logic. We've just finished this quite big piece of research for a whole range of European partners that tried to look at what evidence there is for the spillover effects of public investment in cultural and creative industries across Europe. We started to look at different kinds of spillover effects that were there. We talked about network and knowledge and industry spillovers. This was a very long exercise, and ultimately coming back and saying there's a real gap in terms of the evidence base. There's a real absence of longitudinal research, and there's a real absence of consistent longitudinal research. So a lot of the claims that we make about the value of culture, or the value of public investment in cultural and creative industries, aren't underpinned by strong evidence. It's not to say that that evidence isn't there, it's just that we aren't looking for it, because instead we're looking purely for the stats in terms of economic outcomes, the direct economic outcomes. So what should we be looking at in Iceland? Not just the narrow stuff. We should be looking more holistically, I would suggest, to collectively define the role of culture and creative industries in society, and to leverage, to crowdsource that intelligence in different ways. I'm going to skip through this because I've had the signal already that I'm running out of time. So I'm going to get to the exam questions. Forget all this ever happened. That was the best bit. The Iceland opportunity, suffice to say, there's some obvious things in Iceland, is in that when you've got a population of, 350-odd thousand, something like that? You're in a privileged position to have the most intensive, extensive, engaged research that you could possibly have in anywhere in the world, almost. I worked out, if there's almost 100 or 150 people here in this room, in the UK, that would be 68,000 people. Of course, you wouldn't find 68,000 people who would ever want to go and listen to someone like me rabbiting on. But it shows you that how close you can get to the action with the will, with some coordination. You could not just only have the best and most accurate baseline, you could have the most engaged and collectively owned baseline, but also you could have something that's underpinned by some cultural value propositions that redefine what growth means, what success means, what kind of a society you want to live in, what kind of a place should Iceland be, and what's the role of culture and the creativity in that. And you can see that already through your cultural offer, the way you're positioning your cultural offer, the way you're exploring your distinctive role in this global creative economy. The exam questions, I'm going to really run through these, because have I got like a minute? 3 minutes? Okay. Number one question, I think you're all going to reluctantly trudge off into different groups to discuss these questions after lunch. What types of data should be collected in connection with culture, arts, and the creative industries? First, the most obvious answer to that question is I don't really know. It depends on what you feel is important, but I would, if I were you, look for some level of consistency with other approaches. And the UK was mentioned earlier on. For all of the criticism I've just loaded up on them, there has been a reasonably consistent approach now for over 20 years. And there are these statistical bulletins, which means that you can benchmark and you can work through what the performance of the sector. And it was very useful during the crisis, and it's interesting going out of the crisis to see which sectors and which bits of the value chain are succeeding or struggling. But you need to codify the sector. You might need to redefine the way that this sector is measured. It might mean that you need to develop new definitions or new industrial class and occupational classifications to map and to measure the sector, because there may be activities that you currently can't measure. I think you ultimately need an overarching measurement framework that locates the specific sector definitions that you need, but also looks more broadly at a set of value chain relationships. So you need to have qualitative research that complements your statistical baseline research, and you need a consistent, coherent methodology for doing that. So you need a framework for doing that. A second step is around output data. So this is basically basic stuff: businesses registered, jobs, turnover, profit, exports, all the stuff that you would say is a given. Locational data: where are these businesses based? But then you get the narrative. That's the no-brainer. All that stuff. Then you got step 3 is the story. This is where you need to consult and engage. Gender, ethnicity, education, skills, background, and needs. Core markets and how they're changing. Aspirations. What kind of businesses do they want? What kind of a place do they want Iceland to be as a place to do business in? What kind of value chain relationships? What sort of interdependencies are there? What networks are there? Where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities? And some targeted intelligence. If the sector's saying that there are investment gaps or there are skills gaps, then some deep dive research around those specific issues that surrounds the core baseline. And of course, you need to run the data as well. Location quotients, where are the strengths, which sectors are working in spikes in certain places more than others. Benchmarking with other sectors, is that possible? Comparative research with other comparative countries, such as in the Nordic countries. And demonstration projects, research projects that are powered by investment that mobilizes new kinds of practice. And this... just a very quick example, there are lots of R&D projects now in the arts and cultural and creative industries across Europe that incentivize collaboration between different sectors. Sometimes you get things like design credits, innovation credits. Sometimes it's about R&D between the arts and technology sectors, things like that. But these are disruptive instruments that in turn shape new types of practice, which in turn provide new policy and investment opportunities for governments. So it's not just working with what you've got, it's trying to change practice as well, to develop something new. Question 2, how can statistics support the development of arts and culture and the creative industries? Well, it's a no-brainer, but critically, it's about ownership here. It's not just about comparing it to the automobile industry, it's about developing something that gives confidence to the practitioners working in this sector, and is also something that can help them to inform their business models. It gives them intelligence about their neighbours, about their partners, and about markets and opportunities at home and abroad. So ownership is vital here. But statistics also need to be a driver of critical debate. They aren't the answer, they're part of the conversation. Could you, therefore, pioneer a national or cultural or creative observatory model, a research and development centre for the cultural, creative economy, whatever you want to call it? I know that at a Nordic level, there's a move towards having shared approaches to cultural statistics, so that's one thing. Another thing, though, is to really, really go for it, to build the most nuanced and owned and collaboratively embedded data and intelligence on the sector that you have, and to make it as open as possible, the process and also the knowledge that it generates. Third question, what is the contribution of arts, culture and creative industries to the quality of life in Iceland? Aren't they the quality of life? Aren't they what makes Iceland, Iceland? And that's the Raymond Williams-esque holistic stuff around culture. But I think this is around, there's slight chicken and egg here, in that there's a sense here that the role of culture is the thing that has differentiated you and has enabled you to develop a more kind of sustainable and inclusive and quality kind of growth or understanding of the economy. So perhaps there's a policy differentiation here compared to other countries, which is to talk about the cultural economy. not necessarily the creative economy, the cultural economy, where the business of culture, i.e. the creative industries, and the wider cultural sector, public investment in culture, but also collective investment in culture, becomes the thing, the bedrock upon which your society develops and from which you grow your, an inclusive, valuable, and sustainable economy. And can you pioneer measurement tools for this? Rather than adopting others, can you develop your own measurement tools which fit your strategic agenda? So it goes right back to the very beginning point I made, that often, however consistent you are with other places, these things are loaded with a set of values. So let's be upfront about what those values are in Iceland and develop measurement tools to measure those kinds of values. Fourth, what should the data be collected? How should the data be collected, and what kind of access should there be to this data? To quote Einstein, there's a real issue here because a lot of things can't be counted, and it's a vain, glorious pursuit to try to measure everything on equal terms in equal ways. The search for robustness is a forlorn pursuit. However, in a country like Iceland, you can get a hell of a lot further in terms of evidence-based policy making than other countries because it's round the corner, it's tangible, it's within a smaller sample size. So you can look very broadly at your supply side data. You can map your infrastructure, existing investments. You can map all the stuff that flows into the system. You can map sales. You can map participation in cultural organizations, cultural organizations, in festivals. You can map the perception of audiences, the perception of the markets. You can map change. You can map risk. You can map all sorts of things, which ultimately can influence a set of policy agendas that traverse the overall role of government. They aren't just about cultural policy, they're about education policy, health and well-being policy, all those kinds of things. Fifth, what terms should be used? What terms should be used? Blah, 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 blah. That's almost my serious answer. I don't know what term you should use because the terms change. The critical thing is what underpins them and the extent to which this is something that you collectively own. So codifine. Of course, reference things that you need to reference for methodological and strategic reasons. So I'd look at the European Union because that has the ultimate leverage at a research and policy level, even though you're not in the European Union as such. And also look at UNESCO and their cultural development indicators. And when I say UNESCO, it's also the wider UN family. And then don't forget culture when you talk about the creative industries, because the cultural sector is the lifeblood of the commercial creative industries. And increasingly, cultural organizations are having to operate as creative businesses, partly because of austerity, but also because they can, because of digital, because of deeper and more interesting relationships with their audiences. They can monetize stuff they historically couldn't monetize. Just to finish, in the UK at the moment, or recently, this paper was produced by PricewaterhouseCoopers, so by an accountancy firm, which sends all the wrong messages. Or if you're in the Treasury, all the right messages. They talk about the 7 Ps. The final P, though, and possibly the most important, because it drives through all of those things, is about picture. They say in brackets data. I don't think it's data. I think it's data and intelligence. And that's the critical underpinning for any kind of effective policy and investment in whatever it is you want to call it. So, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you do next.